Morning people, I want to start with two apologies. One, I want to say sorry that I haven't really posted any video content about or during this crisis in Palestine and Israel. My second apology is that my excuse for not discussing Israel-Palestine isn't really acceptable either. Because I'd love to come on here and say, yeah, sorry I haven't discussed it, I'm not an expert so I'm leaving it to the experts. And to a large extent that's what I want to do, and so I'm leaving some links below to that effect. But the idea that any UK citizen can turn a blind eye or even be seen to be turning a blind eye to what's happening there right now is simply wrong. Because we're all implicated in the war crimes that are happening over there right now. We're all accessories to it. You might notice that when I talk about our colonial history here in the UK, that we took over other countries, that we enslaved people, I say we, even though it was my ancestors who were being enslaved. Why? Because I live in a country that benefited from those crimes. I use its health service, I drive on its roads. My ethnic heritage doesn't change that. And if my mate steals food from a starving person and gives it to me, if I'm not able to give that food back to the person, the very least I can do is speak up for the person who's suffering I benefited from. I also say we when I say that we are selling weapons to Saudi Arabia which are being used to commit war crimes, and that's because the government that we keep allowing to take power are selling bombs that they know are being used to kill school children, and the billions they make from that are going into our economy. And it's not good enough to say, yeah, but only 44% actually voted for the Tories. That's really just on them, because how many of us have marched for Yemen? How many of us have campaigned for electoral reform so that an electoral minority is no longer able to put children's blood on our hands? So given that the UK played a significant role in the formation of the modern state of Israel, see the Balfour Declaration, and given that our government has sold over £500 million in military equipment to Israel since 2010, and now this week our navy and spy planes are being sent to support Israel, the UK is directly implicated in whatever Israel chooses to do. We are accessories to it. So it's just not acceptable for us to look away or even be seen to be looking away. But we also have to be very careful that what we say is factually accurate and tells the whole truth. Because with an issue like Israel-Palestine, even if what we say about some act of violence is perfectly factually accurate, if it lacks the context, then it's not only misinformation, it can be dangerous because it can be used to justify further acts of violence. And as you know, it's really important to me that everything I say to you is true, and when I'm wrong, I correct it as soon as possible. I speak about things like what's happening in Yemen, Brexit and human rights, like equality and anti-racism, because I have academic and professional experience in those areas. So when I talk to you about those things, I'm talking from a place of some authority. I used to work for the European Centre for Democracy and Human Rights, which focused exclusively on the human rights abuses in countries like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. I've studied EU law in 2 universities, and the thing about law degrees is they don't prove that you know every law, they just prove that you know how the law works in general, and you know where to look for the right answers. But I haven't studied Middle Eastern affairs, so knowing where to look for the full story is difficult, and as I said, not telling the full story on this issue is dangerous. So I've tried to take in as much information and research as I can so I can give you something useful, a tool that you can use to understand what's going on, even if you don't have the full story. And for me, it comes down to this: power imbalance. Pretty much every major human rights organization has called the Israeli government's occupation of Palestine an unlawful, oppressive, human rights violating apartheid regime, where Palestinian people are systematically discriminated against, denied basic rights like the right to a passport, the right to leave, the right to form political groups, or even freedom of expression. We're talking forced evictions, random jailings, torture. You can see the links below. Whereas Israel is a nuclear power, one of the most powerful countries on earth, with the backing of the most powerful country on earth.
We must be crystal clear. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel.
Now Hamas, a violent and anti-Semitic organization operating out of Gaza, one of the occupied territories, just committed a horrendous act of terrorism against innocent Israeli civilians at a music festival just across the border from them. 260 people dead, with the number now standing at 1,400 dead from the attacks that day, with many more kidnapped. So Hamas, not the good guys. The oppressive Israeli government under Benjamin Netanyahu, obviously not the good guys either. The only good guys in this are those innocent Israeli and Palestinian civilians who oppose the unlawful occupation of Palestine by the Israeli government. So how do we process that every time we hear about some horrendous act being committed? This is where that power imbalance comes in. Gaza is widely referred to as an open-air prison because the people there, the Palestinians at least, aren't allowed to leave. So what would you do if you were falsely imprisoned? What would you do to the people holding you captive? The people in an open-air prison are not free, so their choices and the choices of their prison guards have to be viewed through that lens. This is why it's never useful to look at anything that happens there in isolation, because both sides will always claim they're acting in self-defense. And this is where my brain breaks in two, because self-defense always has to be proportional. If somebody punches you in the face, you don't get to then burn down their house with their kids inside. But at the same time, I'm sat here comfortably in a country that financially benefits from selling the weapons that are being used to commit war crimes in Gaza right now. How fucking dare I, judge the victims of those war crimes for how they act in those circumstances. Now that's not to say that Hamas is acting as some noble hero of the people, because again, violently anti-Semitic organization. Not to mention their funding and motives are well above my expertise level, so let's just leave it at not the good guys. But as for the struggle of the Palestinian people in general, you've heard of the model victim problem, right? It happens a lot in cases of violence or abuse against women. Someone does something horrendous to a woman, but if she doesn't act like a complete angel, if she, say, flirts with the guy first before saying no when the time came, or she comes off rude or unlikable, then we stop treating her as the victim. We somehow forget that human beings react to the circumstances they're put in, either based on emotion or based on pure survival. It's possible to hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. One, the actions of Hamas against innocent civilians are morally disgusting. Two, the Israeli government is always to be seen as the main aggressor because they are the ones in power. They have the ability to restore the human rights of the Palestinian people, but choose not to. Again, it's about the power imbalance, and the real victims here are the civilians in Israel and the civilians in Palestine, as well as Muslim and Jewish people around the world, because the less evolved people of this world think they can hold all Muslim and all Jewish people responsible for the actions of Hamas and the Israeli government respectively. Which brings us to what's actually happening right now. Let's get some definitions out the way. Genocide means killing or physically harming people from a certain demographic on a massive scale. Ethnic cleansing means removing that demographic from an area without the right to return. And the UN's definition of that includes confinement of the civilian population in ghetto areas, forcible removal, displacement and deportation of civilian population, deliberate military attacks or threats of attacks on civilians and civilian areas. And right now, the official line of the Israeli government is for the 1.1 million civilians living in northern Gaza to evacuate to southern Gaza because they're going to invade. And that's on top of the bombings which, according to the Palestinian authorities as well as UN sources, have already killed over 2,000 people this week, as well as cutting off the supplies of water, food and electricity to 2 million people. Although on Sunday it was reported that Israel was actually going to let them have water again. But with all of this, we're talking about war crimes under the category of collective punishment, punishing millions of people for the actions of a group within them. And yet both of the main political parties in the UK have said they completely stand behind Israel. And let's be clear on this because the language is important. Have they also said they stand with Palestine? No. So they mean they stand with the government of Israel, because if by Israel they meant the people of Israel who've been killed by Hamas, there'd be no reason for them not to say they also stand with Palestine, whose people have also been killed and now in greater numbers, and 40% of the people living in Gaza are children. And they added to it this week in Parliament on Monday.
We believe that Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people or their legitimate aspirations to live with equal measures of security, freedom, justice, opportunity, and dignity.
The responsibility for this crisis lies with Hamas. They have no interest in Palestinian rights.
So both of them are well aware that one of the major issues in this whole story is that the government of Israel has been violating the rights of the people of Palestine, and yet they're both standing behind the government of Israel, knowing that they're committing war crimes. That's why we can't close our eyes to this disaster, because whether we voted Labour or Conservative, they've put blood on our hands. And the BBC's been dancing to the same tune. Notice the difference? Israelis are killed, but Palestinians just died? And one line you should not swallow is any attempt to use the rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes as justification for the UK government standing with the government of Israel. Because that implies that your opinion of the Israeli government should align with your opinion of Jewish people in general. And that's how you get hate crimes, because the flip side of that is blaming ordinary Jewish people for the actions of the Israeli government. The line from our government should be, we stand with the civilians in Israel and Palestine who are the victims of unlawful violence perpetrated by Hamas and the Israeli government respectively. And so we call for the human rights of the Palestinian people to be respected. As for how we actually reach a peaceful solution, be it one state or two state, that's well above my skill set, so I'm going to leave discussions of ceasefires to more qualified commentators. But we can't turn away or hide behind not being experts, because at the very least, when the dust settles on whatever atrocities Netanyahu commits with the backing of the UK government, we need to make sure that history can't say it was all done with the support of the British people. So make sure that your MP knows that, and make sure that the Muslim and Jewish people in your community are safe. That's our job. I'm Femi. This has been F Politics in a truly awful week.